It's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to welcome you at our symposium, which is confirming the good truth that the importance of the meeting is inversely proportional to its attendance. So we are happy that we can share with you some of us experiences and research which have been done in the field of schizophrenia and neurobiology of schizophrenia. I would like to introduce the topic in which my colleagues from the Czech Neuropsychopharmacological Society will continue. The Czech Neuropsychopharmacological Society has been founded 1958, which, as far as I know, is the oldest neuropsychopharmacological society in the world, even older than CINP, because it was established just a couple of years after the introduction of first psychotropic drug on the market. So this is the disclosure statement. You know that if you have no relationship to pharma industry, you are independent. If you have relationship to one industry, you are dependent. And if you have a relationship to many pharma industry, you are again independent because they neutralize each other. So the basic problem in study of schizophrenia since the very beginning of the concept of the disease is whether it is the group of disorders or the different expression of a single disease. The first argument is supported by people like Bleuler, who gave the disease the name schizophrenia, who call it originally Gruppe der Schizophrenien, which is plural, and this plural has been forgotten during the 20th century. But Bleuler himself was doubting about it because at the same time, when he called it Gruppe der Schizophrenien, he looked for the common denominator for the symptoms which are occurring in all types and all stages of the disease. So this is the marker of his hesitations in this respect. And this notion was also supported by David Braff in the discussion with Nancy Andreasen, who is the proponent of the unitary model, saying that it's a single disease with different expressions. Nancy Andreasen suggested the 4 levels on the path from causes to consequences, from etiology to phenomenology. The first level being etiological, and listed possible causes and possible risk factors for schizophrenia, including genes and gene polymorphism, gene expression, viruses, the famous study of Sarnoff-Mednick showing that after the influenza epidemic, the consequently the population line of the mothers suffering from influenza revealed a higher proportion or higher incidence of schizophrenia. Toxins, nutrition, birth injury, which is pretty unspecific, and psychological experiences like overexpressed emotions. All this leads to the brain, interferes with the brain development from the conception to early adulthood. It means it interferes with neuron formation, with migration, with synaptogenesis, and with pruning, which is a very interesting mechanism, which can be compared with reduction of density of branches of fruit trees in the springtime, making stronger the rest. This picture is taken from the University of California, Los Angeles, showing the increasing density of neurons and their activity expressed both in brain imaging and the network of pyramidal cells, comparing the newborn, the first year class child and adult, and you see that in adulthood the density of the network is reduced if compared to childhood. This process, which is called pruning, is in a Japanese movie depicted like destruction of connections of the cells, which is different from apoptosis, different from necrosis. It's a process of disconnection. What is interesting, although it's just an analogy, is the computer model using a neuronal network, the network which is capable to reproduce words or to type words in the word processor, which are pronounced just as a voice. And this experiment has been done by Hoffman and McGlashan and repeated later on by Dr. Horacek, who is sitting over there. And this was an interesting experiment showing that this network, which is able to learn, improves the performance after some training to, let's say, 75% of accuracy of reproduced words. But if you randomly reduce the network, damaging the nodes, so resembling pruning, paradoxically the performance of the network is increasing, further increasing. But if more than 40% of synapses are damaged, it goes down to, we would say, dementia. But at the same time, and this is the most interesting, the system starts to produce words without no stimuli. So it can be an analogy of spontaneous hallucination in silence or from the white noise. The similar process to pruning, but different basically, is apoptosis and activity-dependent changes. And all this leads to anatomical and functional disruption in neuronal connectivity and communication, somewhere between conception and maturity, and finally to the impairment in cognitive processes. This is compensated by symptoms which we know as second-order cognitive processes like disturbed attention, memory, language like paralogy, block, perseverations, neologisms, disrupted speech, the executive function impairment, and emotion incongruence or affective incongruence. And the final line is the symptomatology and the phenomenology of schizophrenia, including hallucinations, delusions, negative symptoms, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior, everything what you know from the clinical practice. So this scheme shows that many very different potential risk factors and etiological factors, including infections, including toxins and whatsoever, leads to very different symptoms feeding the clinical picture, which is very variable. But all of this goes through the bottleneck of what Andreasen called latomenology, which is the hidden phenomenology, which is supposed to be impairment in fundamental cognitive processes as a common denominator of this complicated pathway. What circuits in schizophrenia are studied preferably as disrupted or disconnected? One of them is, for example, the fronto-thalamo-cerebellar circuit, which is responsible not only for movement synchronization, as we know from neurology, but also for mental motoric sequences coordination, the decision what should be done first and what should be done then, and so on, which is called cognitive dysmetria, the estimation of space and problem solving, which is impaired in schizophrenic patients. Another example are just executive functions, which can be with some license described as a circuits defining the problem, set control. This is frontal area which is responsible for it. Solution of the problem, diminish the conflict, which is supportive behavior, and parietal and temporal region is responsible for it. And evaluation whether it works. Evaluation, usually it's anterior cingulate and so on responsible for it. It's a rather affective modality. So the executive functions we are perpetuating in can be defined as definition of the problem, solution of the problem, evaluation, definition, solution, evaluation, definition, solution, evaluation. And this can be impaired if the circuits and the network is somehow disconnected. How do we examine it? So there are many neurocognitive tests. You might be familiar to most of them. One of them is Stroop test. Please, hands up, who is familiar with the Stroop test? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, who is not familiar with the Stroop test? So it's 50-50. So please, who are familiar, forgive me the example. This is for those who are not familiar. You can read this word. You can loudly pronounce the word quiz. In this place, there will be on the next slide a word in a Turkish language, and please immediately, once you will see the word, without any judgment, immediately call the color in which the letters will be presented. 3, 2, 1. So this is the trick. If you will be asked to call the colors you see here, it's quite easy. Red, green, blue, provided you are not daltonic. This is also easy, provided you are not dyslexic. This is also easy, provided you are not daltonic and dyslexic. But if you are called to, you are asked to call colors in which the letters are written in this set of words, like red, green, blue, and so on, it's more and more difficult. And sooner or later, anyone will make a mistake. And the time you are able successfully perform this is one of the parameters which can be compared between diseased or disconnected patients and healthy controls. The principle is that what is phylogenetically newer is stronger. So if you are asked to call the colors written in different colors, the written letters in different colors, it's no problem if it's congruent, the visual and the, I would say, lingual signals. But if there is an incongruency, it needs to be evaluated as a conflict, as a paradox, and it needs to employ higher structures of the brain. In our lives, we have a tendency, all activities forward down to the automatic level. If you start to drive car, it's a big problem to look for the left leg, right leg, and the gear and the steer and whatsoever, and to watch the road in front of you. But after comes a couple of months or years, it's almost automatic. You can eat and make phones and smoke cigarettes while driving, and to look for children in the rear seat. But all of this is automatic until the moment if something unexpected happens. So if you want to know how the beginner feels, if you are driving, put your right hand on the left side of the wheel, left hand on the right side, and cross your legs, and you will be exactly in the situation in which the beginner occurs. The same if you are driving bicycle, put your hands on the handbars crossed, but don't tell the surgeon afterwards that it was advice of a Czech psychiatrist. Now, what are the concepts in the brain? We start our neurobiological hypothesis, and all branches of our research, you will hear more from my colleagues. Everything can be traced back to the scheme of Arvid Carlsson, who received the Nobel Prize in 2000 together with Paul Greengard and Eric Kandel. And Carlsson suggested the scheme, which is of course highly reduced, highly reductionistic, but nevertheless very didactic and very impressive and good for remembering and good for keeping the logic of the neurobiology of schizophrenia. In this scheme, this is supposed to be brain cortex. The cortex is bombarded by endless number of stimuli from external world. They can't be processed because they are too numerous, so they are filtered on many levels, starting from perception and ending with the huge filter which is thalamus. And thalamus can be regarded as a doorman deciding who is allowed to enter, who is not allowed to enter, make the cortex capable to process the information. Thalamus is under the direct control, which is GABAergic, from striatum. And this striatum boss of the doorman is under the control of glutamatergic system. There are NMDA receptors on striatum neurons from cortex. Also, the GABA system is inhibited by noradrenergic innervation from locus ceruleus, which is grossly noradrenergic nucleus, and by dopaminergic inhibition from substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area, and also striatostriatal pathways which are cholinergic. This all is extremely important if you imagine that if you, for example, block these NMDA receptors on striatal neurons, ruling out the control of thalamus and open the gate for an amount of information which the cortex is not capable to process, you make the problem. So this is really one of the models of psychosis. I'm not saying schizophrenia, but schizophrenia-like condition, which is used using ketamine, using MK801, and all anti-NMDA drugs or antagonists. The same you can do increasing excessively the inhibition, increasing the dopaminergic inhibition, using, for example, psychostimulants like dopamine, amphetamine-like compounds and so on. And this is a model of so-called amphetamine psychosis. Or it's hand in hand with so-called dopaminergic hypothesis of schizophrenia. The same you can reach by atropine intoxication, just manipulating with the cholinergic system on the striatal level, or via 5-HT2 receptors using LSD or the psychedelic drugs like this. So with this scheme you can explain all possible manipulations leading to psychotic symptoms finally, so we call it psychotogenic pathways. And all these possible manipulations are in fact ideas in behind of animal models and neurobiological models of schizophrenia which are used in the research you will hear later on. So it's like a Mendeleev table of elements that if you forget something, you can complete it because altogether it gives a logic. And at the end of the logic is flooding of cortex with information which are not processable because of these disconnections. And in this way, they can be chemically or pharmacologically modulated. How the clinical picture looks after such a disconnection or such an intervention, like psychotomimetics, psychodelics, glutamatergic antagonists, and so on, is on the next video recording. Can you put the voice on? So, these states are treated by antidopaminergic modalities like antipsychotics, classical antipsychotics like These one who are competitive antagonists on D2 receptors or partial agonists like aripiprazole, for example, and so on. But it leads not only to antipsychotic effects we want, but also to Parkinsonism, to galactorrhea as a consequence of hyperprolactinemia, and so on. In our laboratory, under the leadership of Dr. Horáček, who is sitting here, we tried to compose the vector of the mode of action of atypical antipsychotics by the manipulations which were supposed to be in behind of the complicated mode of action of atypical antipsychotics. And the experiment, one of these experiments, which is quite illustrative, has been finally published in European Journal of Pharmacology, consisted in the normal open field observation of laboratory rats, which was recorded by video camera, stored somewhere in the memory storage and processed in the computer. And the trajectory, which is the outcome of such recording, can be evaluated in terms of the length in a certain interval, the shape, whether the animal avoids the central space or not, and so on and so on. And one of those animals, or one group, was administered just physiological solution. So this is the normal trajectory. If they were made so-called schizophrenic by the administration of MK801, which is an NMDA antagonist, the trajectory looked like this. So forgive us that we consider this trajectory to be an analogy of schizophrenia symptoms. We can't talk to the rat, but we can observe the behavior. If we treated this MK801 treated rat with haloperidol, the result was this one. So you see that the psychosis is obviously over, but the quality of life, if compared to the normal trajectory, seems to resemble that of chronic schizophrenic patients leaning on the wall on the mental hospitals in a gray pyjama and being fed by classical antipsychotics. If we removed the tryptophan, a precursor of serotonin, from the food of the animal was treated by MK801 and haloperidol, but without tryptophan, which is responsible for serotonin, which is responsible for the occupation of also 5-HT2C receptors, which deprive the frontal cortex from the release of dopamine. So if we deprive them from tryptophan, the result was the most similar to the normal trajectory, which is the result you get using atypical antipsychotics sharing not only antidopaminergic but also antiserotonergic efficacy. So, this is after the treatment. This is completely different guy. So, what can be in behind of these disconnections? Some of us are convinced that one of the environmental factors which interferes with the genetic vulnerability in schizophrenia can be perinatal infection. There are many, many reasons for that, and also almost all of genes which are susceptible or candidate genes in schizophrenia have something to do with glutamatergic system. And glutamatergic system is the system which is the most probably targeted by interfering perinatal infection. One of the possibilities will be shortly described later on. So, this is the picture, magnetic resonance imaging from twins discordant for schizophrenia from our department, and you see that they differ in the size of ventricles and also in the density of neurons expressed as a spectrum of N-acetyl aspartate, which has been received by magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So anyway, these twins were monozygotic, it has been controlled, but were discordant for the disease. What can be the reason for different phenomenology of highly heritable disease in monozygotic twins? They should have 100% concordance, having the same genome. But there must be something between genes and phenomenology which can stop the process, or the other way around, which can start the process. So the hypothesis is that the perinatal infection or prenatal infection, as it was in studies of Sarnoff-Mednick, may be the epigenetic factor. And one of the modulators of immune reaction which is in game could be quinolinic acid. Quinolinic acid is a product of tryptophan metabolism. We are back at the serotonin story. Via indolamine to kynurenine, which is switched to this pathway due to activation of astrocytes during the infection. Quinolinic acid is excitotoxic via NMDA receptors because of the toxicity for NR2B subunit of NMDA receptors. So, and at the same time, this quinolinic acid is much increased in viral infection of the brain. So, we suppose that the prenatal infection can lead to postnatal neurotoxic impairment, maybe because of increased concentration of quinolinic acid, which is much increased during a viral infection, and at the same time it's a modulator of such an impairment. It's also proven in experiments made in our laboratory by Dr. Bubeníková, who compared the gyrus dentatus one day after physiological solution application with that after quinolinic acid administration. And you see that the nuclei of neuronal cells after quinolinic acid are heterochromatic, and some of them are in early phase of extinction. So there is no doubt that quinolinic acid can damage neurons, and it can lead to maybe to excessive pruning, which can be in behind of these connections we were talking before, and we are measuring with neurocognitive tests. And NMDA hypofunction, which is a consequence of this NMDA toxicity given by quinolinic, is also psychotogenic, as I demonstrated on the Carlson scheme. So both disconnection and NMDA hypofunction can lead to schizophrenic phenomena in adulthood. Quinolinic acid administration causes neurodegeneration in animal models, and it leads to a decreased pre-pulse inhibition. You will learn more from Dr. Palenicek about these animal models. And we suppose that this epigenetic process superimposes the genetic vulnerability which is given in the mainly in the regions responsible for glutamatergic system coding. So antipsychotics so far are no more than D2 antagonists, but it leads to unpleasant side effects. That's why the second generation is enriched by blockade of 5-HT2 receptors, which improves negative symptoms and diminishes the some side effects. Some of them have even more complicated mode of action, but we should also keep in mind that some antipsychotics of second generation agonize 5-HT1 receptors, which play important role in the regulation of mood and in neuroprotection and neurogenesis. So if second generation antipsychotics are involved in neurogenesis, it's also because they also increase the expression of neuronal factors, brain-derived neuronal factor, as well as antidepressants. and also BCL2, which is neuroprotective protein. And they, by inhibition of glucogenase synthase, they also block to some extent apoptosis. And therefore, they exert some neuroprotective effects, as you see on these Lieberman slides, comparing the total gray matter volume in schizophrenic patients treated with the haloperidol, the green line, and olanzapine, the violet line. So the difference is obvious. And nevertheless, the relationship of these volume changes to cognitive functions is not so far studied in detail. So what are the therapeutic suggestions based upon what I have already said? First, to continue in the blockade of D2 receptors, which we need in nucleus accumbens and striatum, but at the same time, we need to increase the dopamine release in prefrontal cortex and stimulate the D1 receptors in prefrontal cortex. That's why the pharmacological modulation of these processes is a little bit more complicated, as there are stereotactic demands to blockade the bad serotonin receptor and to agonize the good one, serotonin receptor, but not too much, because there is a bell-shaped dependence, to stimulate to some extent NMDA receptors, as we learned that antagonism on NMDA receptors is psychotogenic. The same we can do through the AMPA receptors. We should also think about increasing of cholinergic activity in cortex, about the gene manipulation to express some enzymes which are in game, and also to support the expression of growth factors to support the neurogenesis, or to combine all of these modalities. So it's a future, these are future dimensions in pharmacological thinking, how to influence schizophrenia based on these neurobiological models. So thank you for your attention, and it was just a base for the further contributions.
Teşekkürler Sayın Höschl. Güzel bir doyurucu sunumdu. Kaçıranlar üzülecek. Biliyorsunuz şizofrenin etiyolojisi ve nörobiyolojisi bir muamma. Bu muammaya ışık tutacak en önemli yöntemlerden bir tanesi hayvan modelleri. Hayvan modelleri ne kadar geçerli? Bu konunun yanıtını bize Sayın Palenicek verecekler. Buyurun.